Good morning, everyone. It's Friday, February 18th, 8:33 a.m., and this is a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We are continuing our work in two areas that have been the focus of our work really for the last 5 weeks, and that is Act 250 as well as S148, an act relating to environmental justice in Vermont. On the EJ bill, we've now taken enough testimony that between now and when we reconvene next week, I'll sit down with Ms. Murkowski in Legislative Council, and I think we'll have a pretty clean draft, if not ready to vote, ready for modest final edits for the beginning of next week. But one of the things that we haven't been able to talk about yet, in anything other than generalities, has been the cost of implementing. So I approached the Joint Fiscal Office and asked them to assist us in reaching out to the operating areas affected by the bill and asking them to start figuring out what resources they would need in order to implement the bill. And I think there's a number of challenges, one of which is that there's a build out over time. So not all the expenses are immediate, and some of them are contingent on previous steps. So with that, I'd like to ask Ms. Richter to join us in the meeting. Good morning. Thank you very much. So you've sent us a fiscal note, and maybe usually for our committee, it's helpful if you can screen share and bring up your document because we're on a variety of devices, and the screen is the one thing we all have in common. Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. So as mentioned by Chairman Bray, we were approached to look into the fiscal impacts of S148. And I guess before getting into more of the details, I want to say that that currently as drafted, JFO isn't able to estimate the full impact of this bill, fiscal impact of this bill, and that's due to lacking information or details either from the bill or from state agencies. So everything that I'll be going forward with could change with to the extent that more detail is either added by the committee or added to the bill or received from agencies. So there, from our initial read of the bill, it seems like there are two potential fiscal implications, and that is the per diem costs of the advisory council, as well as the operating costs of the state agencies and departments. So moving forward into the per diem considerations, assuming that members would be entitled to receive the per diem compensation of $50 per day, which is according to 32 VSA 1010, JFO estimates that the annual fiscal impact under this provision would be approximately $20,000 for the 17-member advisory council. However, this is based on a number of assumptions, and as I've outlined in Table 1, there are other per diem compensations in the state of Vermont that differ from this $50 a day. So that is subject to change. I guess I'll pause there and see if there's any questions about the per diem considerations before moving into the estimates we received from agencies and departments thus far.
Right. Well, thanks for this. And it's helpful that some of these I had never, the non-$50 per day per diems. A few I'd heard of and others I hadn't. So it's helpful to know that I think we tend to think of them as all being set exactly the same, but it's good to know that there is a range out there. Thanks.
Sure, yeah. And I do want to reiterate, as mentioned in this memo here, that this may not be an exhaustive list of the differing per diems, but really serves as an example. So it could change. Or there could be more out there, I guess, is what I mean to say. So I'm not seeing any more questions, or comments. So I'll just move on. The next table, table 2, which you'll see on page 3, we reached out to all of the agencies and departments that have been asked to testify before your committee and asked if they could estimate the annual cost of this bill. And so this table here outlines the responses that we've received from these agencies and departments. JFO has not verified or further analyzed these estimates. And so really we just took what we've heard back from the agencies and put it into this table. Not all agencies that have testified before your committee have responded thus far. So this table and this estimate is subject to change with more responses moving forward. I guess the major additional point I just want to add on top of this table is that several of the agencies got back to us with expected increases in full-time employees. And so we used an average cost of $125,000 per year for these estimated full-time employees, unless otherwise stated by the agency. So all of these costs summed together is a minimum cost of approximately $3 million, but as I've mentioned, this could change in accordance with more agencies coming in, or if there's more direction or specific information further identified in the bill. I do want to add that the bill doesn't specify the source of funding for any new administration costs, so we cannot further analyze, the effect on different funding sources because that's unclear.
Mr. Chair, did any of the departments? So we were talking about before you got into the note that there's rulemaking, for instance, and then there's a community engagement planning process, and then work begins in areas to implement the policy, sort of promulgated throughout their own operating areas practices. So it's not like just throwing the switch. I'm guessing that in every department it will phase in over time. Did any of the operating areas talk to you about, is this their estimated annual cost when fully up and running, or is this an FY23 cost? Or did they come back with that sort of granularity of when they expect to be at this level of expense? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I don't want to speak too much for each individual agency and department. I would say overall, this cost is really reflective of a few years out when the bill has had more time to phase in what they expect these longer term costs to be. In terms of FY23 and FY24, let's say the majority of respondents did not have that level of granularity in their responses.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Any committee questions? Yeah, Senator McDonald.
Mr. Chair, we are in a position we've all been in often before, but we're fortunate enough to have Senator Westman on our committee who might give us some advice on how we can move ahead with these uncertain numbers and whether we should plug in an estimated number given the limitations that JFO has. We know appropriations is going to make the decisions on this, and Senator Westman might give us some guide as to when these numbers may actually be settled and when appropriations roll and solving this perhaps at a later date.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm not sure at this point what we can do that's most useful to appropriations other than get the process started. And I'm thinking that it'll be revisited in the balance of the session. Senator Westman, what's your thinking?
Sorry I'm late. Just tuned in, and so give me a minute to catch up, and then I'll have an opinion.
Okay.
So did you hear the question?
I didn't hear the question. No,
Yeah.
I didn't.
Well, Ms. Richter is presenting us with budgetary needs for this bill, but she's been quite frank that many of the agencies haven't yet been able to make the calculations, and that they're using rough estimates that you would expect a JFO to use under such circumstances. And there really isn't much we can decide on or approve or disapprove. And traditionally, when such a bill passes to appropriations, it has a placeholder in it. And
Yep.
appropriations does the granular work that we usually are unable to tackle at this time in a bill's formulation. And I was wondering what if you had some advice on how we might move ahead without spending an inordinate amount of time here and natural resources on those numbers.
Well, some of this, and I'm looking at down through the, will they all be hired immediately? And how many positions in total is this?
We don't know, and we won't know when they're hired immediately. Today, or perhaps in 24 hours or 48 hours, we won't know the answers to those questions. So that's why we're calling on you to give us some advice.
So the truth is, the truth is with this, Mark, is whatever the number that we put in our bill, the positions and the money will be stripped out and will be put in the budget. So whatever we put in for the policy will move ahead, but the dollars and the positions will not be dealt with probably for another month, because they won't be dealt with till they're put in the budget. So that gives us time to, I would think that maybe by late the third week in March, we might have an idea, and that's about the time the budget will be moving.
So I was asking the chair to ask you what your recommendation should be to us. Should we spend a couple of days trying to estimate the number of people and when it all piles in, or should we provide a ballpark number that's
I think you should
reasonable?
my sense is you'd provide a ballpark number, and you tell the chair of appropriations that that before we got to the budget, that we'll have better numbers.
Well, you've answered my question, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for taking this short delay.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And I think, frankly, we don't, my plan was that we would just stick with these numbers for now to move the bill. And then, as Senator Westman suggested, revisits some of this later. But the amount of things we have to do between now and March 11th is, it's a long enough to-do list that we'll come back to it after we've passed crossover. So, but we can keep it cooking in the background. All right. So thank you both. Back to Ms. Richter.
Thank you. The last part of the memo just outlines a few more considerations from our behalf in terms of the uncertainties and a few, let's say some of the parts of the bill that would need to be further clarified for us to maybe have a better understanding of the fiscal impact. So this is on the bottom of page 3, excuse me, but just the fact that as you were just talking about, the bill doesn't currently contain any appropriations for administrative costs or council compensation. It doesn't identify any new sources of funding. So that really reiterates what I've been saying thus far, is it's hard to further estimate the fiscal impact from our end, given current current information availability. And I also wanted to just note that this, the 55% of overall benefits for the investments to go to the environmental justice populations. There are a few questions that remain from our end regarding this provision, including how these benefits will be measured. If this percentage is the total investments or the total investments within each agency or department, and just a few more considerations, but I'll leave it at that from my end, but I'm happy to answer any more questions from the committee.
Okay. So if you could stop screen sharing, then I think we're probably all set with the document. Then we'll see each other better. Okay. Any committee questions for Ms. Richter? Okay, okay. Well, we knew we were handing off sort of a messy assignment, because it's a bill in progress, and I think operating areas themselves are just figuring out what a bill that's still in progress is going to mean to them. But that's all right. We get started, and then go through other iterations and tune the numbers over time. All right. If there are no further committee questions, so that document is on our website for anyone who's interested in revisiting it and reconsidering. And thanks for the questions too at the end, so we can make sure, because those do relate to policy. For instance, who's enforcing, and what are the consequences of a failure to meet a target? So, okay. With that, then we will change topics and move back to our work on Act 250. S234 is the vehicle we're using for discussing issues related to planning and housing. I would say that, let's see, a couple days ago, I felt like, as we worked through this discussion, I felt like I was sort of bucked off the horse. But then with riding, the thing is, you always get back on. So now we're getting back on. I'd like to just come to discuss some points with the committee. But first, I did send to Ms. Haskell some questions on behalf of the committee related to the ARPA funded pilot, or whatever we might call it. And so with that, well, the first one was just the scope of activities. If we're being asked to waive Act 250 for ARPA funded projects, what kinds of projects are we talking about? So we know what we're being asked to agree to. And so good morning, Ms. Haskell.
Good morning.
And if you could fill us in a little bit to what degree you can help us understand what that would entail. Our focus has been on housing, but it may be that the administration's interest is broader than that, or housing's the focus.
I will tell you that this is, not an area where NRB gets too involved right now, but housing is the key focus, as we have discussed in other testimony. But I think that the ARPA funding includes other projects, infrastructure, transportation. I reached out to colleagues. I heard from the Department of Economic Development that childcare centers, that type of thing, mixed use developments in the village centers and downtown, in our historic downtowns and village centers should be a part of the mix as well. And I would suggest respectfully to the committee, if you have the time, to bring in folks from housing and community development or economic development to hear about that.
Yep. Okay, great. So one of the things any witness can do is help us identify with whom else we should be speaking. So that's very helpful. So you're talking about Department of Economic Development?
Yep. I think VCHB has Vermont community housing, yes, has been before your committee, but maybe it would be, have them come back, because one of your other questions for me is, what level of funding would, is available, and I don't know the answers to those things, but they would have better ideas, certainly.
Okay. I did have some additional conversations since we met yesterday as a committee with the housing community. And one piece of advice I got was to tread very carefully into the world of housing, because it is complicated in terms of the number of different programs, both at the state level and the federal level, relationship between those programs. And now if we have layered on top of that, we're going to have ARPA guidance that's going to influence how monies can be expended. And then there are people operating different sorts of programs. For instance, VHCB's housing that I think tends to be perpetually affordable, so as opposed to these time-limited programs. Okay, so we'll work with hearing from people who can fill us in. And any community questions for Ms. Haskell on that in terms of range of projects? Senator McDonald?
I don't know who the point person is on this one for the administration, but we're talking about roping a horse that got out of the barn. I'm not interested in getting back on a horse that has 20% of the housing at 15%, 15 years of a measly 15 years of affordability, while 80% of it is there are no limitations. The missing middle here, we got middle class people that need housing. We've got the money, and this horse is not packed for the amount of money that is available, and it's embarrassing for us to even consider turning this money loose to people who get to use it for their own purposes, and there's no assurance that it's going to low-income people or even middle-income people. I'm not ready to rope and get back on this horse until that's resolved. So that's my personal, narrow-minded, perhaps minority point of view, but I'm sticking with it.
Okay.
Senator McDonald, I'll be happy to try to direct your concerns to the right people and have somebody, the appropriate person, be back in touch about that.
That'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Senator McCormick?
Thank you. Just, Mr. Chairman, his mixed metaphors notwithstanding, I agree with Senator McDonald.
Okay. Yeah, I think, part of, one of the healthy things that goes on with working on a bill together is you keep peeling layers of the onion back. Another metaphor, sorry, there. And one of them is I think we started with the concept of we were taking the priority housing project model and just being asked to extend it to being funded through ARPA. As we learned more about what PHPs entail, I think we've come, I think the sense, I'll ask each member of the committee to weigh in on this. But my sense is that members of this committee all want to see, quote unquote, a better deal for low and moderate income Vermonters when we receive this once in a lifetime money, whose origin is responding to COVID. And we know that COVID impacts have been more severe for lower and moderate income Vermonters. So I think we're looking for a way to be more effective in helping those people in particular find housing. Senator Campion.
Mr. Chair, are you proposing that ARPA funds, projects under ARPA funds are exempted? Is that I'm looking to try to understand the direction that you're trying to move us in.
Yes, so that would be just what we did for PHPs if we did it for ARPA funded projects, but looked to design the program to be more helpful to those low and moderate income people. So along the lines of what Senator McDonald said, longer term affordability, a higher percentage of units, some mix thereof. There could be other variables. We don't know enough to design the program, but I think that's the direction I hear people moving. Senator Westman.
I would rather use the term middle-income Vermonters, because I would tell, and I said this before, I think the group between $60,000 and $120,000, I don't know how they can get into housing.
Right. Right.
There's generally no help for that group of people, and with these rising prices of housing, I think it's a nightmare for them to.
Well, and it reminds me a little bit about what we learned as we dug into weatherization, namely that we would have funding for incomes up to 80% of AMI, but in fact, most of the funding was exhausted by the time you got to 60% of AMI, and people from 60 to 80 were sort of in a funding desert, and then 80 on up, they weren't supported because they weren't. Their income was too great. They're off the benefits cliff. But we know that there are many people in that category who would like to do more, and yet they lack the capacity to do that. So Senator Campion, does that help?
Yeah, and so what I'm trying to get a sense of is, I live in this world of where I just like to count votes. Is this? You said that the committee is moving in this direction, and Senator McCormick and Senator McDonald usually. The words exempting people from things don't usually mix with the two of them. And I just am trying to get a sense of when you say that this is the direction the committee is moving in, that if I just want to make sure that's accurate.
Okay. Well,
and I'm trying to figure out for myself as well. So,
yeah. So let's pause for a moment and take the temperature here. Is that, and I'll, not to put you on this spot, Senator McCormick and McDonald, but you're Act 250 stalwarts. So is this
stalwarts or scholars?
Yeah, I said stalwarts, but they could be scholars too. Is this something you're willing to consider supporting? Something you would.
I'm not sure what. I don't know how this horse is packed. We learned last week. I learned last week, to my surprise, that we are making a host of changes to Act 250 in order to facilitate the construction of housing in downtowns. I'm not opposed to that notion.
Right.
But I was shocked to learn that this federal money, tax money, that was going to go to build the housings that we will either permit to be built downtown by changing the law or not permit, were going to be houses that had a mere 20% available to people of low income. And that was for a tawdry 15-year period. And that the other 80% was, and I at the prerogative of the owner of the building that the tax dollars had subsidized. And even the 15% that was low income, the owner could, under circumstances yet to be clarified, could simply evict them and say, your 15 years are up and now I'm going to rent these to the market. Senator Westman has articulated what I think several of us on this committee are equally interested in. It's the missing middle, whose home buying opportunities are being not nibbled away at, but stripped in the last 18 months as COVID refugees have come and bought the housing that the middle-class folks would have purchased and rehabilitated. And we're learning they're buying those houses unseen. And those people are being added to the list of low-income folks. And if we're going to move this bill, I think we should be darn sure to see that we are not simply subsidizing the builders of homes with public dollars to serve everybody but the very groups that we believe are being left underserved and overburdened in today's housing markets. Now, that may be too idealistic a view, but the times are changing. And if we don't change and keep up in our laws, our citizens fall farther and farther behind. And the building industry will continue to cater more and more to the people that have the money to, and they will continue to build second homes for people that already, or third homes that already own a couple of homes, and they're not going to spend their money on the Vermont population that we say we're interested in serving. And that's my long speech. But if we don't ask ourselves where we're going to be a couple of years from now, we're fooling ourselves. I last night, as I looked for this horse to be roped again, I thought about how much we patted ourselves on the back for the housing bill we did a couple of years ago. How much of that housing, which has a 20-year bond on it, we will not have finished paying off the bonds, and perhaps people will be getting evicted before the bonds are paid off because there was only a 15-year window for affordable housing. I don't know the answers to those questions, but we darn well ought to know them before we march down this road together. So,
Well, yes, I appreciate, we came into this not knowing what the quote unquote the deal had been. We've learned about the deal that we've made in the past. We're saying we're not interested in making that deal again, especially for all the reasons you say. The other thing that, I think you allude to that's a useful reminder, I don't think we've ever had a time where there's been such economic disparities for income. So the missing middle has been getting thinned out by the way our economy's been trending year after year after year.
the witness, Ms. Haskell, said that this was tough for her to answer today, and I certainly understand that. And that she was eager or prepared to go back and come back with some answers. And that's when I don't want to get on the horse to even think about putting a saddle on the damn thing until we see what we get some more information.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me just pause before we go into Senator McCormick. Ms. Haskell, anything you want to say in response, or shall I keep going?
Please keep going. I will definitely do some research on my end and be back to the committee, but I don't have anything to add to
Okay.
what. Yep.
Thank you.
Understood.
Senator McCormick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To continue on Senator McDonald's observations, I think most of us have some concerns that our prosperity is not equitably distributed, but that's a separate issue. I want to make clear that that's not where I'm going with this. I think by and large, market forces have made us a prosperous and happy nation, but market forces are not always benign. And that's when the government jumps in. And I think the housing problem we have is that market forces say to developers, make high-end housing. You make a bigger profit off of high-end housing than you do off of affordable housing. And when market forces are not favorable, when market forces drive us as a society into places we don't want to go, that's when the government comes in. That's where we use government money to basically oppose the market forces. We have a problem. We have a housing shortage. And we have a ton of federal money available to us for a short amount of time to provide for affordable housing that market forces do not move us towards. In that regard, I think we have a duty to use that money as beneficially as possible. I don't think the 15-year running order is that. I don't think it is the most beneficial use of that money. I also think, and now I'm going to get to Act 250, I agree it would be an awful shame to leave that money on the table. We want to get it spent on affordable housing while we have it. And I am perfectly willing to work with this committee in making Act 250 move a little faster. But the idea of an exemption, I have already spoken at length on that. I do not buy the argument that Act 250 is the problem. I think the problem is market forces. I don't think the problem is Act 250. But even if it is, Act 250 has benefits. And I am not prepared to deny the people of Vermont those benefits. The argument often, when we heard from Susanna Davis on a whole other issue, but she mentioned how we frame the sentence, how we use the language when talking about something indicates how we're approaching it. We are dealing with Act 250 as though it's a problem, and that not having Act 250 is a benefit. And I do not agree with that fundamental analysis. Also, I don't think we have to develop Act 250 exemptions to use the ARPA money. If we can develop ways to make it all move a little faster, then that's where we ought to go. So I think my colleagues are going to get tired of hearing me because I've been making the same argument for a long time, but that's since you asked.
Okay, no, it's good to know. And Senator Campion, can you say
Yeah,
something?
no, I appreciate the conversation. Yeah, I too am focused on building middle and low income housing. And I would say the other piece of it is building it in the right spots. And if there are ways to do that, it really is an incredible crisis out there. Senator Westman's example of the small 650 square foot, $99,000 home in Stowe going now for $400,000. I just don't know how young people are going to pull any of this off, without massive investments from their families, etc. They have student loan debt, but even there, we also know not all families can make those massive investments in their children after they've already given so much. So yeah, that is, I'm looking for ways to do it and do it in smart areas.
I do want to make one correction to you. That was not in Stowe. That was in Cambridge.
Wow. Yeah, that was in Cambridge. Yeah. No, it's unbelievable. Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time, but right now it's certainly a lot worse.
Well, so Chair Haskell has given us some recommendations for areas, folks we can learn more from about the housing piece. I think I would like to clarify that the committee would support, for the most, a majority of the committee would support me working with Ms. Murkowski to draft some language that would reflect directing how we might design ARPA-funded housing that is well located, designated areas, for instance, and that it also has more supportive terms in terms of the cost of the housing, the length that it stays affordable, the number of units, the percentage of units within a project that would be affordable. And so we don't know how to design that program, but I think that's what I would like to craft with Ms. Murkowski and bring back to the committee. But I want to verify, I mean, because we're going to need to get ideas down in black and white between the four corners of a page to review it. So rather than have this run out as an interesting idea, but not yet drafted, I'd like to get the committee's support for me moving forward with Ms. Murkowski to bring that back to the committee for discussion and review next week.
That's, Mr. Chair, that sounds like more than reasonable request. That's what we do all the time. Will perhaps the chair of the Housing and Community Affairs will you be working together to take their expertise on the financial and legal aspects of housing that is targeted at certain populations, or will we be working without any of that knowledge as with Ms. Murkowski?
Right. So thanks for that pointing out. So I continue to talk to Senator Sirotkin regularly, and the Pro Tem has arranged earlier this week a meeting to help these two committees move forward in a coordinated way, and we'll be meeting again at the beginning of next week to do the same thing. So there's not that much time from now to crossover. We don't want to waste any time. So I will, Senator Campion.
Well, and I think this is accurate, but we're sort of, it's doing these exemptions, and we also in the administration is 2 thumbs up with the road rule being in there. Sort of like a trade, right? I'm looking at Ms. Haskell's face. I can't tell if it's, God, Brian, you're brilliant. That's a great idea. Or can I delete this kid from my screen? Not really.
This isn't about the road rule. This is just about basic housing, for heaven's sakes. The road
Right.
rule
Well, the question is, all this is Act 250 stuff. This is one bill. Am I missing something, Mr. Chair?
No, this is all one bill.
It's all one bill. Yeah. So I just, there are a lot of different components to this bill, and I just, I was really only joking. I know where the administration is on this, but we're talking about the same bill.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the version that I sense the majority of the committee supports includes the road rule.
Okay, that's just the other thing I just wanted to get up. And Senator McCormick, are you saying, I just want to get a sense of where everyone's at. Does this mean, I don't care, or does it mean something else?
No, you're saying I don't.
No, I'm sorry, Senator McDonald. He kind of did his.
We're going to have a discussion over the road rule. We'll do the things that we usually do, and we'll wrestle with the administration on that. That's a change to Act 250. What I'm more concerned about isn't the changes to Act 250 in the downtown. I'm concerned about spending money.
Oh, I get it. Yeah,
enhance, speed up, and fund the market forces we apparently think are treating the state badly, and that's where we ought to. That is a call to arms for everybody, and regardless of which side of the road rule you're on.
Yeah.
That is the.
Got it. Yeah.
That is the issue.
No, this is good. This is helpful.
Core issue.
Yeah.
And we're just talking about the color of the saddle on the horse when we get to the road rule.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, it's all one bill. It's all one package. I just want to live in, again, the world of reality where people are at, so that we can move this as quickly as possible.
Right. Yes, I'm sort of regretting.
Get someone at the door. I got to go. and I'll be back. I apologize.
I've used that excuse also sometimes when you don't want to talk about something.
Okay, now we can have a vote. Well, the clerk will call the roll. So, now thanks, Senator Campion, for helping us, get down to brass tacks, like what's in, what's out, where are people landing?
I mean, my point is, these are uncomfortable conversations, but I'd rather have them now than, the day that we're voting.
Yeah, or on the floor. No. So, okay. So I'm going to work Ms. Murkowski, line up witnesses who can answer the questions we need answered.
Yep.
And my hope is that we will, in a really expeditious manner, be able to come back to this and wrap up our business and move it on. In terms of how it moves on, my original intent, and it has always been that the bill would just travel as is to the floor. There has been some conversation in Economic Development Committee of incorporating this bill into that bill, but I have I do think I have a little PTSD from an experience like that roughly 2 or 3 years ago, where our Act 250 bill became part of a housing bill and then went through kind of an excruciating floor process that involved many questions of germaneness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would want to have my eyes wide open before we do anything other than move our bill as our bill. Mr. Shoup, you have appeared on the screen, and that's usually a hint that someone is raising their hand, really. So would you to join the conversation this morning?
I do have a question. Brian Schatz with Vermont Natural Resources Council. So I'm trying to understand what has changed since Wednesday. And is my understanding that the proposal is the bill as it was being considered on Wednesday, with the addition of exempting any ARPA funded project anywhere for the duration of the ARPA funding?
No, I think we are working and will continue to work, I think, to offer a more narrowly targeted and defined projects. For instance, here we'll see where we land, but it could be something like ARPA funded housing projects in designated areas.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. I have nothing else. I look to seeing what the proposal looks like.
Okay, me too. And that's my cue to Mr. Murkowski, you've come on screen, so I'll follow the same thing. I'm wondering if that means you've been listening to the conversation this morning and you have observations, thoughts, questions for the committee.
Well, I was a little bit intrigued by the end of your finishing that thought before, and so I'm sorry if I'm interrupting anyone else who's going to testify next, but are you not working on any other sections of the bill right now?
At the moment, no. Senator Westman.
I think Ellen's question is exactly the question I've got. What I've heard a compromise developing around is the discussion about housing in designated areas and adjusting who the money went to. And we want to focus the money on lower and middle income families and the focus around that. I'm not, and I appreciate Senator Campion's question. I'm not sure beyond that what we're talking about now.
Okay.
I'm very supportive of the issues that Senator McDonald has put out, because I was thinking that we were moving in a direction for stuff that is in designated downtown areas, that we would begin to adjust where that money through ARPA might go. And I'm very interested in that sort of a line of thinking. I'm not really clear, as I think Ellen is, what that means beyond that now.
Okay, well, so great questions, because that will help us define the overall scope of the bill. I think I'd split it into two pieces. The first section were a variety of adjustments to municipal law. There were, I could go section by section, but
I made that nice chart.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah, you made a great chart.
She's here, she has the chart. Let's go to the chart, because to your questions about what's in, what's out, we can see a section by section overview, and that's probably the best way to walk through it. If you can, if you're allowed to
Do you want me to
screen
put it
share
on
yet.
the screen, or does
Yeah,
someone want?
let's put it up on the screen.
So on Wednesday, on your committee page posted under my name is the chart listing all the sections of the bill. I don't know if it was reposted for today, but it was posted on Wednesday, and I don't think I have screen sharing ability at the moment.
I bet it's gonna arrive any second. There we go.
It is, yes, okay. So here, sorry, let me make sure it's big enough to see. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes,
Okay.
Perfect.
So last week, Senator Westman asked if I could put up a chart, make a chart listing the sections, but also the decision points. The decision points were hard for me to sort of nail down, because I don't think you've had a ton of discussions on individual pieces of language. So I put some just generic decision points on the side, just for basic consideration. But there are a few specific questions in that third column.
Okay.
So the first handful of sections, the first three sections deal with municipal zoning, and they came out of H511. Senator Bray, did you want me to go through each provision?
I think, let me check this out with the committee. I think if we just went briefly section by section to refresh people's memory of what's in there, then I would ask for just to poll if everyone's like, fine, we can let it stay, or if someone says, hey, I'm not actually, we need to talk more about that. So let's, I think that's fine right there. So do the people want to hear more about what section 1 actually does beyond?
So section 1 of the bill is the section that has the language for the requirements of a neighborhood development area. And so it's making 4 changes in that statute related to the requirements a municipality has to have to get an NDA designation.
Okay. Do people want to hear more about what that means? I see a lot of studying going on. Can you say a little more about it? Obviously, I think people need some refreshing.
So first, it would allow towns to file joint applications for getting an NDA designation. That's not allowed currently. They write in Senate Economic Development that an example of this would be Burlington and whatever town is directly south of it. Because Burlington's, because the location of Burlington's downtown and neighborhood development area. So I don't know how many other towns would be in a position to use a joint application for a joint designation.
Maybe, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Senator.
Maybe one of the ways we could also go through this is each time it might help those watching, et cetera. Who is this helping, maybe tee it up? This is going to make it easier for whom? This is in here because this is what this would actually end up doing. That I think could be helpful.
Okay.
So for example, this to me looks like it's a request from municipalities that would make development, streamline some of the processes. I'm looking to Ms. Chakowski. If you could.
Yeah, I would characterize it slightly differently. So this would allow, so an NDA is an area that is defined in law, a geographic area.
Right.
And so currently an NDA can only exist in one town. And so if there's a town where the NDA is very close to the border of another town, the NDA sort of has an awkward shape because it can't cross the town border. And so this would allow towns to jointly file so that it could cross a border. I want to be careful, and I don't know how many towns would actually be able to use this because I don't know how often an NDA actually would potentially cross a border. This was requested in H511, which was originally proposed by some in the planning community. So I haven't heard a ton of testimony on how many towns would actually be able to use this.
But that's very helpful. That background is tremendously helpful. Thank you very much. This makes sense to me, given that.
So I would just, what comes to mind for the village of Underhill Flats is in both the towns of Jericho and Underhill. And so the village is a divided village. That's the first place that comes to mind for me with this.
And South Burlington is actually L-shaped. It wraps around the south side and the east side of Burlington. So there's a lot of development in that area. And I could imagine someone might, I don't know if that's whose proposal is behind it, but it's easy to imagine a coordinated application because of how densely developed and close the two are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, thank you.
Chairman, may I just?
Yeah, Senator McCormick.
Yeah. I mean, I can read English, but I'm having trouble picturing the world that this is talking about. What would not be allowed now that would be allowed if this were to pass? Just describe a hypothetical situation.
So in statute, the size of a neighborhood development area geographically is defined. If that neighborhood development area is immediately on the border of another town, the prescribed size of the NDA is cut off. And so this would allow that if it's on the border, the NDA could extend into an adjoining town, and therefore a larger area that would span two towns could be designated as NDA. The benefit of that, of course, is that there are a number of incentives and incentive programs that come with the NDA designation, including the use of priority housing projects. So this would allow a town whose NDA has been cut off because it's on a border of another municipality to have it extend into the other municipality if those towns file the application jointly.
Okay. Thanks.
Hey,
I think Mr. Shoup would like to add something.
No,
Sure.
Thank you. I think you have explained it. I think maybe it might be a little confusing. You need to recall that an NDA is associated with a designated village center or a designated downtown. It's a radius around that. So it's really the instances where you have a village that has a designation can get an NDA within a certain distance of it. And I think Senator Westman gave a great example, Underhill Flats. You look at Waterbury Village, you look at Middlesex Village. Those are villages that are adjacent to a neighboring town. So this would allow the neighborhood development area to be served, to be within the radius of the village center or the downtown in the adjacent municipality. And we, and just for the record, we were involved with working with Representative Bongartz and James with this and have no objection to it.
Thank you very much. It's good to have multiple people in the same conversation. Okay, not seeing any other questions on this one. Let's go on to section 2.
All right, so the next one is a little more, no, we're not going on to next section 2. There's 3 other elements to section 1 that are actually more complicated than what we just talked about.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, are
Yeah.
we signing off on this? Can we expect to see this again? The question's been asked, just trying to.
Yeah. So my hope is that if people have a concern that they no longer, that they don't want to see this in the next draft or don't want to see it in there with without a substantial change of some sort, to let us all know as a committee that you have that concern.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Murkowski, yeah, if you can take us through the other provisions in Sec 1 that should be called out.
Sure. So this section also allows some new areas to be part of the NDA. So as we just discussed, the NDA is a defined mapped geographic area. Currently under the statute, flood hazard areas are excluded from the NDA. This language would allow the inclusion of flood hazard areas if they are suitable for infill development as defined in ANR's rules. And if there's an additional provision that says if it does include flood hazard areas, the local bylaws must contain provisions consistent with ANR's model rules for the whole town's flood hazard area. So it's allowing now these areas in the flood hazard area to be part of the NDA, which gives them access to incentives and benefits. So the buildings in those areas can be eligible for things like becoming a priority housing project. The town does have to adopt bylaws consistent with ANR's model bylaws for the whole town in order to do this.
Okay. Any questions or concerns? Okay. Let's go to the next one.
So it then also strikes the requirement that NDAs have either a municipal sewer system or an approved community or alternative wastewater system. So currently, to get an NDA designation, the NDA has to have a municipal sewer or a community wastewater system. So that would no longer be required.
The development would still need the appropriate permitting from ANR, but it becomes a developer responsibility to gain that as opposed to a municipal responsibility to provide that. Is that a way to phrase it?
Yes, someone will need to get a permit at some point, but this is just taking the responsibility off the town. Yes.
Okay.
In the
Senator
designation process. Yes.
Senator Westman?
Well, that was a piece of my question. So a multi-unit housing development, the real piece about this is that the town would not be have to apply. It would be the developer that it would apply. It's who does the application is what this is really getting to.
So it's not precluding the town from doing it. It's just striking the requirement
Okay.
that they do it. So the town still could have municipal infrastructure. So it could happen, yes, but it is striking that it is required that an NDA have the infrastructure already.
Okay.
Right, and happily there have been grants going out, especially in the last year for larger wastewater systems and stuff like that for village centers or. Okay, if there are no questions or concerns on that one, then the fourth piece of the section.
Right. So then the last requirement clarifies the language, amends the language regarding how density is calculated under this statute. So the NDAs are required to have a density in their zoning of at least 4 units per acre. Currently, that language reads 4 single-family dwelling units per acre. And this is changing that to be 4 residential units of any kind per acre. So it's changing the way that the density is calculated. So it's not requiring that the calculation be based on using single family dwelling units.
Right. And isn't there a second proviso that travels with that one that says at least 4, but if you have another section of town zoned more densely than 4 per acre, you have to match that? Do I remember that correctly?
Oh, yes, that's in the underlying statute. Yes, the NDA has to, yeah, it's greater than or equal to 4, and it can't be less than other sections of the town.
Okay.
So the density can't be, it can't be less, you can't be less dense in the NDA than other parts of the town.
Okay. Thank you. So any
So-
questions?
So what's the difference between a single family home and a residential unit?
So largely here, we're talking about the use of multi-unit dwellings, so apartment buildings or duplexes. And so this potentially could allow more density than what is allowed now, because under the current calculation, it would be 4 single-family houses on quarter-acre lots. But this would be allowing apartment buildings and duplexes to count towards that. And so I think it's potentially a small change, but it's not, it's moving away from the requirement that the density be calculated based on single family houses only.
Okay. Well, it actually seems helpful to me in that if we're talking about more affordable housing, single residential units, I think, are probably more expensive than duplexes and multi-unit dwellings per unit.
And so this is also providing flexibility, because it's not requiring the town to use multi-unit, allow multi-unit dwellings specifically, but it is saying that if in this part of town that is allowed under your zoning, they can be used in the calculation of this density requirement.
Okay, thank you. Any committee questions or concerns? All right, onward to section 2.
All right, so this last language we were just talking about appears in section 2 in the statute regarding the new town center designation. So the density requirement under the new town designation is currently vague. It just says high density. So it's changing it to be explicit, and it matches the NDA language. So it's requiring that a new town center have density of 4 residential units per acre within its zoning districts. And again, if the town allows for greater density, as Senator Bray mentioned, you cannot have the new town center be less dense than other sections of town.
Okay.
This is a minimum.
Yes.
Okay, any committee questions or concerns on that one?
Oh,
Okay.
Okay, and then so section 3 adds this language about municipal permits must last for at least 2 years. They shall not expire in less than 2 years. And this is extended specifically to site plan permits and conditional use permits. This currently under statute, there is no reference to required expiration dates for municipal permits. So towns have the ability to set expiration dates if they so choose. There has been some testimony that towns some towns put expiration dates on their permits for 1 year or potentially less. And so if a developer is unable to complete the project before the permit expires, they need to reapply. So this would extend the permits to no less than 2 years before they expire.
And I think the notion was that the expiration doesn't necessarily benefit the project because you're just required to go through you have to reobtain the same permit you had. And there's cost and uncertainty and time involved in that. So, all right, any committee questions or concerns? All right, here we go. Section 4.
So sections 4 and 5 do relate to Act 250, but they are also from H511. So first, Section 4 raises the cap on the number of priority housing projects that can be exempt. Currently, in the smallest towns, up to 25 units of priority housing projects are exempt. This is raising that to 50 units can be exempt from Act 250.
Any committee questions or concerns on that change to the cap on PHPs? Senator McDonald, we can't hear you yet.
You referenced the cap on PHPs, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do we? I'm not interested in doing stuff for PHPs until I understand what they're going to permit being constructed. We haven't defined. We're not sure what PHPs means. And I don't want to give away stuff. And it is questionable in exchange for without getting some gains in the PHPs. So.
Okay. I think we know what PHPs mean, but I think the question was, is it an attractive enough program that you want to facilitate the development of more PHPs? So I'll put a flag.
Until we know what PHPs are, I'm unable to gauge the attractiveness of site.
Okay. Got it. So I'm flagging that one as.
I don't know who likes to go on blind dates, Mr. Chair.
So I would just like to clarify, the priority housing projects, PHPs, are defined in Act 250 currently.
Yep.
I think I don't want it to be confused with the proposal Senator Bray was proposing before we had this discussion. So currently in your bill in S234, I believe this is the only change that is being proposed, not changing the other elements that you have discussed. And so there are existing other elements of priority housing projects, including the year, the issue of the length of the affordability that you have discussed. So currently this is changing just the number of units that are exempt. It's not changing the other elements.
Well, until we nail that down, I'd like to, if it goes one way, I'd like to restrict the number of elements that could be developed. And if it went the other way, I'd like to enhance them. So it's kind of premature.
Okay.
But
So
I will
I don't
stop.
think-
I will stop.
Okay. Well, and I'm just saying, I think the proposal that we started discussing before we began the walkthrough is to create an ARPA funded pilot that is not PHPs.
What is a pilot? What's a pilot?
It would be a time constrained program to use ARPA funding for
Okay.
housing,
Yeah.
for instance.
Pilots are ways to do things without having to nail down what they are, so that we can claim that we're going to learn something from the pilots. They're not used when we know what's going on to justify what's going on when we believe that what's going on is wrong. So pilot is a pejorative word used by people on different sides of the issue.
Okay.
And if we're building houses, let's call them houses and describe the terms of them. Let's not ascribe adjectives to them that pull people's attention away from what it is we're talking about.
Okay, so I'm going to rewrite the record to say I never said the word horse today, and I never used the term pilot. It would be a program with a sunset on it. I think that's where we're going, and it would be ARPA funded. So but sticking to the actual language that we're considering, it's just the current PHP program that we're talking about, altering the caps dependent on village or town size. So I flagged mine.
And so that would be a permanent change in the statute, this cap.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Because I'm not exactly sure what the priority project in a small town. Could this be anywhere in a small town, or would this could be anywhere in a small town you could do, or is this confined to a village in a small town?
So it does have to be confined to one of the designated areas. Currently, village centers are excluded. So it's the other designations, downtowns, new town centers, growth centers, and NDAs. Priority housing projects have to be located in them.
If that's as confining as I think it might be, and I would not want to see it preclude, say, for example, an elderly housing project and have them say, to fit the designation, I'm going to put 25 in instead of going to 40. And it's confined to more or less a village within that. I'm interested if it's confined enough to allowing us to go up.
Okay, so that's helpful. And if there's not more questions or discussion on that one, I'd suggest we flag it and then we'll revisit that as part of a larger bill where we'll see a balance between the different features. Okay.
So the other change in section 4 updates the definition section of Act 250. It updates the definitions of flood hazard area and river corridor to match ANR's updated definitions. And then it also updates the definition of mixed income housing due to VHFA's change in how they calculate mixed income. So both of those are fairly technical changes.
Right. Any committee questions or concerns on those two pieces? All right. Then let's go on to number 5, please. Section 5.
Section 5 updates criterion 1D of Act 250 to reflect the use of the ANR definitions, flood hazard area and river corridor.
Basically a conforming change.
I don't want to characterize it as a conforming change because it does change the language, but I think, I can't remember if you took testimony on this or if it's one of the many other committees looking at this language. But the language was requested by ANR to match their process and how they look at flood hazard areas. So I believe the intent was not to be a dramatic change, but it does reflect ANR's recent changes to how they look at flood hazard areas and river corridors.
I think we had Mr. Evans in on this. Okay. Thank you. Any committee questions or concerns about that? All right, section 6.
So section 6 amends Act 250, and it requires that towns that receive requests from Act 250 applicants, they have to respond to those requests within 90 days. Otherwise, the application will be deemed to have no impact under criterion 6 and 7. Act 250 criteria 6 and 7 relate to municipal services and educational. I mixed this up. 6 is educational services and 7 is municipal services. So when an applicant is doing their application for Act 250, they usually have to ask the municipality if they will be causing an impact under those criteria. So this is requiring that the town respond within 90 days.
So that's basically to cover things like schools for any new kids who could be in the area, plus wastewater, drinking water, if there's municipal services there. Does it include things like fire rescue police service?
Yeah, I think it's actually primarily the latter, because there are multiple criteria on water as it is.
Yeah.
And so I do think it largely is often used related to, fire, police. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any committee questions or concerns on that one? All right, section 7, force blocks.
So first, in section 7, there are new definitions related to the new criteria related to force blocks. And I just wanted to point out in this section that there's a definition of fragmentation. I should not have included it. That was an oversight, but the word fragmentation is not actually used in your bill. So there probably shouldn't be a definition of it added to Act 250. But the other definitions include force blocks and connecting habitat.
Okay. All right, so definition 46 could just on fragment that defines fragmentation could be omitted, correct? Is that what you're pointing out?
Right, because your new criterion 8C does not use the word fragmentation. A prior draft had used fragmentation in the criterion.
So this is basically an orphan from an earlier version.
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Chairman McCormick, please.
thanks. I'm sorry for not raising my hand, but I'm off screen. If we're not using the term fragmentation, what terms are we using? Because we are trying to deal with fragmentation.
So
Are we not?
Your language in section 8 amends Act 250 to add this new criterion 8C. And it requires the applicants to Act 250 not cause undue adverse impacts to forest blocks and connecting habitat. It doesn't mention fragmentation. It
Doesn't
just
it's just an undue adverse.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty standard Act 250 language. Okay. All right, that's all.
So for section 7, that's the only edit there then is, well, any committee questions or concerns? We added a definition and we take out the language that's left over from an earlier draft, the fragmentation definition. Okay, seeing none, let's go on to 8, which you just started to describe.
Right, so section 8 adds the new criterion 8C. This is the language your committee passed in H926. And it adds this new criteria for undue adverse impacts to forest blocks and connecting habitat. So I put in your decision point column whether or not you should look at the language from H233. I mentioned that because I made you a slideshow showing the various options you have for language changes to 8C that you have considered before. including whether or not to go back to the original language from H233 or some variation of it. But I don't think you've actually had much discussion on that, so I wasn't sure if you had made the decision to just stick with this language.
Right. Right. Well, safe bet, since we liked it once, we might still like it. Do people want to schedule time to look at alternatives to this, or maybe people just want to read at their leisure? It's kind of a joke. The slideshow where Ms. Murkowski laid out the different versions of this. We were going to go through that roughly 10 days ago, and our schedule got crunched, and we never got to the slideshow that day. So what's your pleasure? Senator Westman.
Do we have time for her to come in and just run through this? Because I'm not sure.
Okay, so let's plan on scheduling that, or who knows, this morning, maybe we finish the walkthrough and we can go to your slide deck. Exactly. And Ms. Murkowski, just let me double check, because I know you've been busy going committee to committee to committee. How long are you able to stay with us this morning?
I'm free until 11:30.
Okay, great. So maybe let's flag that one to take a look at what we are, what the alternatives are. And let's go on to section 9 then.
Sure. So related to that entire discussion, section 9 requires rulemaking for criterion 8C for the new criteria. So this would require the NRB working with ANR to adopt rules for the use of 8C, including how any maps should be used for forest blocks and connecting habitat. So this does require that that the rules be adopted before the criterion is used. So that is another element of this.
You know, I'm noticing now, and Senator McCormick's question prompted it for me to go scanning for the word fragmentation. We do use the term fragmentation in sub 2 and in the middle of page 13 from my reading copy. And I wonder if that would be helpful then to keep that in, because it will provide guidance to the rule makers for what we meant by fragmentation in the rulemaking section. Does that make sense or not?
No. So if you wanted to take that definition and put it in the rulemaking section, I think you could do that, but you don't add a definition to a statute where the word is never going to be used.
Oh,
so the
sure.
rulemaking section is session law.
Okay. Well, that would seem, it strikes me as helpful if we're going to use the word fragmentation, and we've given a lot of thought in the past to what we meant by that. And if I were someone making a rule and I read the word fragmentation, I might wonder what the legislature meant by it, and including the definition in the rulemaking session law section seems like a useful thing to me. But I'm looking to you to see if we didn't do that, are we being less clear for the rule makers about what we're aiming to have them do? And I think I'm wearing my LCAR hat a little bit, because if I were an LCAR and I wanted to judge this rule, I would look at what the legislature meant by fragmentation.
So sure. You can add a definition to the rulemaking section if you'd like. I think that's going to be part of the discussion you're about to have, since we're not actually looking at the language for the rulemaking section, which is already quite detailed. I do think it would be appropriate to add a definition if you would like. I was just trying to point out that having a definition in a statute for a word that's never used in the statute isn't a great idea. So if you'd like to use it in the rulemaking section, I think that could potentially be appropriate. We will maybe look at the language in a few minutes, but
Sure. So let me put
the
let me put that on
definition
the
of
table.
fragmentation was added because prior drafts of this bill and others used the language from H233, which was a standard based on fragmentation,
Right.
not undue adverse impact.
Right. Okay. And right. So to be clear, I'm not thinking we would leave it. We would move it into the rulemaking section. It would just be session law. We won't be adding a superfluous definition to statute. Okay, so let's walk through how we describe the task in.
But you want to do that now?
Yes, please, section 9. I mean, just to walk through section 9. Isn't that where we just left off?
That's what I was just discussing. Yeah, you want me
Yeah.
to pull the language up from section 9?
No, that's okay.
Oh, okay, so that's the rulemaking section, section 9.
Yep. All right. Any committee questions on the rulemaking? And I think Ms. Murkowski pointed out to me, and I would just share with the committee that as I understand the history through her telling me the history, that previous definitions have simply been inserted into statute. In this case, because there was a lot of discussion around how it should be defined, we actually chose 2 years ago to use a rulemaking to ensure a robust conversation with all parties at the table. And it would be the rulemaking that would end up figuring out how to implement the fragmentation and habitat corridor piece.
Rather than,
So in the past, when new Act 250 criteria have been adopted in statute, they don't usually include a rulemaking requirement. There are a couple that have, but normally it goes through the sort of district commission process as opposed to doing a rulemaking. So there are pros and cons to that. The pro is that doing a rulemaking would provide the applicants a lot more information on how to use the criteria. One of the cons is that it then will take an additional period of time, probably at least a year, possibly 2, to then use the new criteria in Act 250 applications.
and what, the chair, this is something you're interested in moving in this way? Can you say a little bit why?
Sure, I think because in previous discussions around it, they were complex enough and contentious enough that it felt to me like one way to ensure an even-handed formal process with all parties being able to come to the table, evidence, a public record developed, and then a rulemaking ensues, that would be a better process for getting to the final result than what we were able to achieve legislatively at that moment. And I feel the same way today.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go on to section 11.
Section 10 quickly is
sorry.
a very small section. It contains a couple of small amendments to the existing statute requiring A&R to have maps. So this language would add forest blocks to A&R's maps and establish procedures for updating maps in the future.
Okay. Thank you. I don't see any questions or concerns. Section 11.
So section 11 is the section on the road rule. Your committee, the draft 1.1 of your strike all amendment adds the new language that says the road rule will be triggered when with a single road or driveway of 800 feet in length or combination of roads and driveways of 2,000 feet in length. You did discuss removing the 800-foot threshold I think you've had more discussion since I was last here. So I don't know where your conversations have landed on the road rule.
Well, that was definitely, I don't think we settled on it. So let's pause while we're here as a committee and see if there is a sense of I'd like to know the sense of the committee's position on maintaining the current language versus returning to the original. So this one I would say is a more sensitive trigger, if you want to call it that, in that if it's a single road or driveway, it's 800 feet, or if it's in combination, which is where we started, it was 2,000 feet. And I'd like to know the committee's pleasure on how sensitive a provision they would like to have built in. Senator Campion, I see you nodding. Does that mean you'd like to stay with the language as currently drafted?
Yeah, I like the language as currently drafted.
Okay. Senator McDonald, he's getting fodder. Senator McCormick.
Yeah, I like the language as presently drafted.
Okay. And Senator Westman. Okay. I couldn't hear what you said, but no. Okay. So I myself, I think would vote to stay with the language as currently drafted. All right. So let's leave that. And we did receive language, and I forwarded it to you, Ms. Murkowski, from Ben Rose, who I don't know if I know you've had an avalanche of work. Maybe you may not have seen it, but he had some modifying language that suggested we don't want to trigger a definition of improving the road if it's just to meet the requirements of building a road that's replacing a culvert, for instance, so that it has a greater capacity to handle intense rain events or stronger ditching, something like that, which I think I saw agreement around the room at the time, but let me double check. So we don't want to, if someone starts to address climate change and rain events on their road, making those changes won't constitute road development at that point. Or is everyone fine with that? Any concerns?
Mr. Chairman, in principle, yes. I think we need to be very careful about the language on this because, that making the distinction between a repair and an improvement.
Yes.
Okay, we want to make that there's a gray area.
Okay, so Ms. Murkowski, can you add Mr. Rose's language, the next draft, and then just highlight it as new language so we'll revisit it in situ?
Sure. And I'll just add in response to that, the last time your committee worked on the road rule, which was in 2020, you did spend quite a long time discussing repairs versus routine maintenance. So there is already some language in there clarifying, but it looks like the language you're referencing further modifies so I can take a look at that.
Yeah, I don't find fault. I don't find any fault with the language before us. It's just, I was not on the committee at the time, and I'm just raising it as something I want to make sure about.
Yeah, no, it was a very sensitive topic at the time. So let's add Mr. Rose's amendment, which I think is entirely in keeping with our intent and just helping to avoid some sort of unintended consequence. Senator Westman.
If you built a substandard road and what you're doing is correcting a culvert, so you're putting in ditching that would bring into compliance so it doesn't create runoff, I'm for that.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so we'll look at the new Rose language in the next draft. I think that completes, well, let me double check. Any other concerns or questions about that section? Seeing none, onward, please.
Sections 12 and 13 relate to wood product manufacturers. Section 12 adds definition for wood product and wood product manufacturers. Section 13 then uses those definitions in Act 250 to provide specific permit conditions that are extended to wood products manufacturers around fuel delivery and hours, allowing hours, some hours of operations on nights, weekends, and holidays during the winter.
Okay. And my basic street language translation is they can accept log deliveries earlier than their normal operations. And they might be making wood, wood chip deliveries out either earlier or later, because it is fuel, and depending, and when you need fuel is weather dependent, and they may need to respond to a particular cold spell and truck early or late in order to make deliveries. Okay, if there are not any committee questions or concerns on that one. Senator McDonald.
I thought the reason was that for the chips was when you're hauling chips out of the forest, you want to haul it out when the ground's frozen. And
right.
That's sometimes they haul it out, midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. That's different than delivering, but to schools and businesses that use chips. But that's a subtle difference.
Yeah, sorry, I conflated the two. When I was saying delivery, like receiving materials into a facility, that would be the guys leaving the woods at 3 in the morning while the road's frozen. And
yeah, I remember the first time I saw that, I called up the neighbor to say someone was stealing chips out of his woodlot at midnight. And he said, no, he said they're hauling it out at midnight because that's when the ground is frozen and it doesn't, chew up the fields and the farm fields. It doesn't chew up the woods. Yeah.
Okay.
Live and learn.
Yep. Thank you.
This section does capture both of those scenarios.
Okay. Seeing no other questions or concerns on that one, section 14, 1 acre town.
Right, so section 14 amended the language regarding the jurisdictional trigger for 1 acre towns. It made minor language changes so that the language was identical to the jurisdictional trigger for 10 acre towns. This was initially requested because of the Snowstone case that the Supreme Court ruled on in the fall. So I put in the decision point category, is this necessary? Because I will, I think the committee already knows, but the Supreme Court this week did reconsider its decision from the fall and has withdrawn it and used a new new decision. So the 1 acre town issue was not addressed, and so the prior precedent on using the 1 acre threshold will stand. So you may not need to make this change if you do not want to.
And to share with the committee, so I had thought that perhaps because there was in at least one judge's mind ambiguity about what this current law meant, maybe we should make the change in order to try to preclude a future misreading of the statute. But what the point has been made to me that the interpretation of that statute is now crystal clear because there's 50 years of precedent plus the Supreme Court case affirming its interpretation. And that if we add anything, even if its intent is to further clarify, we create an unintended consequence of reopening the definition to litigation. And so I wouldn't want to be well-intentioned, but actually do a disservice to everyone by proposing a language change. So Ms. Murkowski, can you talk us a little bit through the legal fine points of that decision to leave it, basically to remove this section at this point would be the choice?
Can I get back to you on that?
Okay,
I think most of what you said is what I would have said. I may have used different language, but yes. Okay, so I will say that if you amend the definition, the first time that definition is used by an Act 250 applicant, there would be potential for the court to then make a ruling on how that language works. And so if you do not amend the statute, that will not happen. Could it happen again in the
case to
future?
remove it, right? That's what the chair is saying, right? Just to remove it.
right.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good decision.
So Mr. Shoup has reappeared, so I know what that means. Mr. Shoup, some thoughts on that? You know, I mean, I think we're talking about avoiding the potential risk versus making the edit.
Yeah, I just for the committee's background, we intervened in that, the VNRC intervened in that case, and we're a party both to the motion for the court to reconsider and their ultimate reversal of the decision. I guess I'm not sure what the downside is. So I'm not sure if we have a position either way. The court did issue a very clear decision that it was the size of a tract of land, just like a 10-acre town, which was a little bit differently worded. So I don't know what the downside of being clear in case they come to a different conclusion with a different set of judges in the future. On the other hand, if you see a downside, I understand don't rock the boat if you don't need to.
Okay. So in some of my other work, I do editing, and I'm always feeling like if there's ambiguity in language that invites misinterpretation, better to proactively change it, as this section proposes to, in order to preclude that misinterpretation. It's a favor to everyone to be more clear. The risk that it could then be challenged, I don't know what kind of difficulties that would entail for future applicants or courts or et cetera. And so if both Mr. Shoup and your colleagues and Ms. Murkowski, you and your colleagues could discuss it and come back with, I don't know, sort of a risk assessment for the committee. And I think we could make a decision one way or the other.
Yeah, we'd be glad to. I'd like to consult with our attorneys. So thank you.
Yes, I would like to look into it further.
Okay, thank you. Let's do that. So that brings us to 15, section 15.
Section 15 amends the primary agricultural soil mitigation requirement under Act 250. This would remove the requirement to mitigate the loss of primary agricultural soil if the project is a state-owned airport. Currently, under the statute, if a Act 250 project is going to destroy primary agricultural soils, the applicant needs to mitigate that, and there are different options for how that is mitigated. But there are different ratios for how much soil needs to be protected versus how much is destroyed. And it does range between 1:1 and 3:1. There is a formula, and the statute is quite detailed on how the formula is used to calculate how much soil needs to be protected if soil is going to be destroyed. So this is just saying state airports don't have to do that.
Okay, and I have a question. I don't know if you know the answer, or you have to do more research, or Mr. Shoup happens to know from experience, whatever. The question is, a hypothetical state-owned airport, they own 1,000 acres already. 100 acres is runway. That leaves 900 acres for other stuff. And on that 900 acres, there's 10 acres of buildings now. They're thinking, oh, we're going to do a freight service out of here. We're going to build another 10 acres of warehouse. If they already have their Act 250 permit for that.
Who's going to build a warehouse?
I don't know how the arrangements work, but I think there are private businesses co-located at state-owned airports.
This is a private warehouse being built.
Yes.
Okay.
private warehouse being built. Has the prime ag soil definition and any kind of mitigation requirements been calculated already when they did the full 1,000 acres? Or as they even with their existing permit, are they going to have to amend it? And during that amendment process, that's when someone will say, well, you're consuming 10 more acres of agricultural soils. Now we're going to calculate the mitigation related to that.
So it depends. First, there's a couple different things happening in that scenario. But I will say, if there's going to be new construction of improvements on a parcel that already has an Act 250 permit, they will need to get a permit amendment.
Okay.
So in your scenario, if a building is going to be built, it is likely, though I can't guarantee because it depends, that they will need to get an Act 250 permit amendment. When they do their permit amendment process, you look at the 10 criteria of Act 250, and you have to address those that apply to the site. 9B requires that you look at if you have primary agricultural soil that is going to be lost or destroyed by the project. And so if that new construction is going to impact the primary agricultural soils, that will need to be addressed in the permit amendment, which is when you then get to the step of mitigation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Is it possible that a project that already has an Act 250 permit has already mitigated loss of primary agricultural soil? Yes. The criterion 9B was not part of Act 250 when it was enacted in 1970, I believe. And so it is possible a project either didn't have to do the mitigation under its prior permit, or that the project as originally proposed did not destroy any primary agricultural soils.
I see, right. If it predated the addition of 9B, they haven't had to face this question before. Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator McCormick.
do we have another bill on this? Didn't Senator Parent introduce a bill, or was he advocating for this policy in this bill?
No, it was a separate bill, and at a moment in time, we were considering adding things to the bill to make it a bit more comprehensive. We could also say to ourselves that we're interested in narrowing the bill again. So it's completely up to the committee's discretion.
So is this basically Senator Parent's bill put into this bill as a?
Yes, that's
I'm remembering his
Yeah.
testimony, and I'm wondering if it's relevant to this.
Yes, if you look on the chart, I did add the reference to S278. Yes, this is the language from S278, the bill sponsored by Senator Parent.
Okay, it seemed to me, listening to his testimony, that he was making an argument that could be made to the district commission when applying for an Act 250 permit. Why would we give the exemption? I remember it was a compelling argument. He said it's all gravel, it's post-industrial, it's not agricultural land. Anyway, that's the argument.
It's not prime agriculture.
Right. I mean, that's the argument you would make to the district commission. I don't see why that would justify an exemption.
Okay. Well, so I would be, I think we were in an expansive mode at that point in time. Now I think we're actually contracting a little, trying to be a little more narrow and focused. So I think, let me float out this proposal that we remove this section until we, people can weigh in, vote to re-add it later. But for the reasons Senator McCormick just outlined, I'd say, let's not have section 15. Okay.
I think that makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
That-
So if we
That saves
Thank
me
you.
from asking 116 questions.
that's a
I'm
I'm
not
going to
making that
amend.
Okay.
I almost want to put it back in so we can get those other questions. But for now, let's pass and we'll reconsider adding it another time. So that takes us to section 16 in the environmental court.
Yes, so section 16 appropriates $300,000 to the environmental court to hire one temporary judge and one temporary law clerk for the environmental court, and it uses ARPA funds for this purpose. This also came out of another bill. I apologize, the reference isn't here. This was in S270, Senator Brock's bill. So the question I do think you need to consider, is this a proper use or a permissible use of ARPA funds? I have consulted with JFO. If you'd like a proper consultation, I think you could reach out to them. This potentially could be a use of ARPA funds. However, ARPA funds have to, there does need to be a clear tie with COVID and backlogs created by COVID in order to use the funds to hire additional staff. And so I'm not sure if your committee or if any committee actually has received any testimony that the environmental division has a backlog caused by COVID that this money could be used for. So it is, this potentially could be a permissible use of ARPA funds. I would recommend that you receive testimony from the courts establishing the causal connection between COVID and a backlog. Alternatively, you could direct that this be general funds. If that's something you're interested in, I would also raise the issue that I am unfamiliar with the hiring of temporary judges. I have not seen that before. It's a little unusual to appoint a judge just for a temporary period of time. It's not like hiring, a temporary law clerk. It's a judicial nominating process.
I'm trying to remember that we had some turnover at the courts, and well, Senator Westman.
We quite frequently take Superior Court judges that are retired and fill them in to back up, and there is a process. I think what we need to do in this is first ask in the environmental court division how backed up they are and what the problem we're trying to solve is. And then you would worry about, would this be, what funding source would you go to do it? I think what you're going to find is they are backed up. And if they are backed up, then the question for us would we recommend that we do something about that backup? So I think we should take some tests.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator McCormick?
Yeah, to continue Senator Westman's analysis, I serve on the Judicial Retention Committee, and every judge up for retention, one of the things they do is they describe to us their work and doing other kinds of courts other than the ones of their own court is very, very common. We have Superior Court judges who act as substitute Supreme Court justices. They are temporary Supreme Court justices. Of course, they're already judges, so it's not exactly the same thing. But I agree. I think what we need to do is take the testimony. I can say this, that virtually everyone we have been dealing with since COVID has said that COVID has caused a backlog. I mean, that's common information, but we also hear it directly from the judges.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. One of the beauties of the committee is we learn from each other. So, Ms. Murkowski, I think I have a note. Is it Mr. Griffith is that the right name of the new person taking over as like court administrator or?
I don't know. I do know that the court administrator recently retired. I don't know who the new contact person is.
Could you work with Jude and me to find out whom we could get testimony from on this question, please?
Sure.
Thank you. All right. So we'll get that testimony. That is helpful. Thank you, everyone. How about, I think that takes us to section 17 of the bill.
Yes, so section 17 is contains the language from S-235, which is Senator Bray's bill on requiring a report looking at Act 250 jurisdiction over agricultural businesses. That report would look at whether or not there needs to be different levels of jurisdiction or different jurisdictional thresholds for agricultural businesses. And so this would have the, I believe it's the NRB, look at that issue and report back.
And well, I don't want to belabor it. The case, the situation that came up that triggered the bill was Nordic Farm in Charlotte, where they're talking about doing something innovative, but it involves bringing, I think, a total of somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 35 potential other businesses onto the farm. Everything that they're talking about, if from food to honey to compost to using growing grains for distilling, etc., they're all related to agriculture, but they're also they are businesses. So how do you, if this is an opportunity worth further developing, sort of part of our value-added agricultural economic sector, how do you do it well? And I don't think people know, because this is a particularly ambitious proposal. And so rather than have us sort of bump into it, I thought it might be worth facing it square on and asking NRB to come back with recommendations. That's what this is about. Any committee questions or concerns about leaving this in? Okay.
I think it's good.
So let's go to section 18, please.
So section 18 contains language that is currently in H511, the municipal zoning bill. So this is a report on the status of the designated areas program, the state designation program. So this would appropriate $150,000 to the Department of Housing and Community Development to hire a third-party consultant to review the state designation program and how it's currently working and whether or not it needs to be updated and harmonized and report back to the legislature next year. My comment in the decision point, I think the only conversation that you've had on this language is that some of the language potentially is awkward or vague in this section. So you could consider amending it if you were interested in pursuing it.
Okay. Well, and I think this came up, I mean, it originates as Mr. Murkowski just said in 511, and part of it became of interest, I think, to our committee, not just because it was in 511, but because as we're working with designations this year and other years to see what kind of regulatory impacts those designations have, for instance, an exemption being grounds for a project that could be exempted from Act 250. There was conversation amongst different folks, including ACCD, of, like how many different designations do we want? How well do they work together? Have they grown up sort of organically but topsy-turvy? And might we be better off at revising them? And that certainly potentially didn't have an impact on Act 250. So I thought it was worth including in our bill as well. If the language is been criticized by some as being vague, can you, I don't know that you need to recommend witnesses right now, but could you help Jude and me schedule people who would help us examine that language for how it might be improved? Mr. Murkowski.
Sure. I mean, you can take testimony. I mean, I would assume that the department would want to weigh in.
Sure. And I don't know if you yourself, having reviewed the language, have recommendations.
Well, I did draft it. I mean, I will say, I think it really is about the committee's intent. The language was originally requested by the department. And so they provided much of the input on the actual language that's in there. I don't think it's overly vague. I think some of the language is just a little awkward because it does, I think that it was pointed out in this committee, it directs that the consultant review and make recommendations to modernize the state designation program. That is an unusual term. That is a little bit vague. So I think that overall that there are stakeholders who are interested in seeing a full review of the state designation program because it has been developed and amended in a piecemeal fashion for the last 25 years. And so it has taken on functions that it wasn't originally intended to do. As you mentioned, it's now being considered as part of Act 250. So but it would just be that I think also the committee's intent on what they would want this report to be about.
All right, so thank you. We usually, our point person on modernizing anything is Senator McDonald, so I would really want to turn to him to help spell out what we intended there.
Modernizing doesn't mean, modernizing its vocabulary wise, it's a bucket of warm spit.
And we do generally avoid that in drafting, so that's good feedback.
Mr. Shoup, you came back on the screen, so can you say something about this report?
I did, thank you. We in my testimony, I had a couple of specific suggestions for clarifications. I'd be glad to work with Ledge Counsel and Chris Cochran at DHCA to kind of confirm or clarify any language.
Great. And if I can, I think it'd be helpful if you do consult, and if you can help chip in at this point any new language suggestions, that'll help us move along. And if you send them to our counsel, then she can present them to us, and maybe we'll be able to edit if
yeah,
from there.
And so, sure, yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so the last section is on a study committee. So it creates a study committee of legislators to review the Natural Resources Board structure and governance and report back on whether or not there needs to be changes made to the Natural Resources Board. Decision points on this. Your report back is due at December 31st, 2022. So that's about 6 months for a study committee. And I did just want to point out that part of the Commission on Act 250, the next 50 years, a significant portion of their work in that large binder was reviewing the structure and function of the Natural Resources Board and making recommendations on changing it. So I do know that that report came out 3 years ago now, and a great 3 years it's been, but that's just something to consider.
Sure. And the reason I asked to have that included in our original bill was that I think there has been enough discussion around governance issues related to the NRB that I'm aware that there's the potential for, restructuring, improvements, enhancements, whatever we call them. It could be related to funding, staffing, etc. I'll just offer my blunt assessment. I think they've lived on a very tight budget for long enough that I think it's been difficult for the NRB to flourish. So that said, how we would make those changes, I think could easily be an entire single bill. And as a matter of fact, the House has one. So, but rather than us take on what I thought was just way too much work in this bill, I said, okay, let's acknowledge that there's a need for and an opportunity for improvement, but let's put that off till next session, the first year of a biennium, when we'd have ample time to make a really important, consider really important changes that could have an impact for a decade or more to come. So that's the reason for doing it as a study. It's really not a kicking the can down the road. The concept was set ourselves up for year one of the next biennium. I don't think we've had feedback on that December 31st, 2022 date. Mr. Shoup, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one.
No, I'm sorry, I was multitasking.
Oh, I can, when I see people moving more, I haven't learned to recognize multitasking from an interest in speaking. All right.
We rarely see such bursts of honesty from those of us who share the Zoom experience.
Right. Well, and also I'm very conscious Chair Haskell is in the room, and I don't want to, it feels a little awkward to be talking about her organization without inviting her into the conversation again. So of course, actually you could have jumped in anytime this morning, but I didn't see your screen light back up again. So, but do you have any thoughts about the utility of studying changes at the NRB in the next session?
I know there's been lots of conversations about this, as you pointed out, over the last, 2 to 6 years. I think a study committee is a good idea. I don't know how I feel about December 31, but we'll make it work. There's certainly things that I think deserve it, particularly with so many different topics that Act 250 is going to attach to.
Okay. And the other thing I would ask you, Chair Haskell, to really look at is the language for what is studied about the NRB. If you could say, well, these things seem on point, but you've omitted something else that's actually quite important to our organizations and its functions, that would be helpful to us. I mean, my goal is that we never ask for a report that is not as helpful to the operating area as it is to the legislature. So, or at least potentially so. So, okay, thank you very much for that. Mr. Shoup.
Now that I'm back in the press, yeah, I would agree with the Chair Haskell that we've advocated for changes to the NRB for several years and would and don't have any strong feelings about the date.
Okay. Right. Well, and as Ms. Murkowski has alluded to, the big binder, the Act 250 Next 50-Year Commission spent time on it. So part of the reason it has a relatively tight date is that one, wanted it to be available at the beginning of the next biennium. Two, that there's already been ample work done and it could bootstrap that work group's work. The other thing I would ask for everyone who's looking at this to consider is the membership of it. So right now it's quite a small group, just limited to the legislature, and that's in part because it's the legislature that will need to act, but I'm certainly open to a different membership if people want to make suggestions there as well. And if people do have suggestions, if you could send them to us in the next 72 hours, that would be helpful because they could then be considered and put in, reviewed, and possibly incorporated into the next draft of the bill. Actually, I should get Friday. That would be Monday.
State holiday.
Oh, it's a holiday.
Holidays.
I have to say, what is it?
What are those?
President's Day?
Yeah, and it's also a big vacation week for families that have school-age children.
Okay, well,
Just FYI.
Don't have to homeschool them that day.
It's an excellent point. Some of us would like to have a vacation.
Right.
Seems unlikely.
yeah. That's what we have summer. That's what we have summer for.
Staff out next week.
All right. Okay. Well, so great. That brings us. So thanks for any suggestions on that. And that brings us to section 20.
Effective dates.
And section 15 is
The primary agricultural soil language. So I will strike that.
okay. Okay. And then for the new ARPA funded language, ARPA funded housing proposal, I will work with Ms. Chakowski to put together some language so we would see a new section. And then that would be boxed in time to begin, whatever, effective on passage, and then end 2027 when we finished the ARPA funding window. So there'd be a sunset built in. And I would like to, I don't know, honestly, one of the things that we could say is that this is a bit of an experiment, and could we see how well it worked? Did it deliver what we were hoping for? Did it have unintended consequences? I've thought that what would be useful at the end of it to maximize what we learned from it would be a report. I honestly don't know who is sort of both expert enough to write that report and not vested in that, doesn't have a vested interest in the report. So I'll have to think about that some more, but that's the concept, that it would conclude with a report to let us see what we got done through any such ARPA funded housing program. So if people who have been on, involved in drafting reports have useful suggestions as to how it would be a meaningful report, very open to your suggestions.
It doesn't sound like a report I should draft.
A report you should draft? You mean the Village Council will write the report?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a report I should draft. So
Okay. Well,
that'll
so
narrow it down.
all right. So all those in favor of having Village Council draft a report at the conclusion of the ARPA funded housing project, raise your hand. Well, this is actually 2027, so there's a certain safety built in here. You might have recovered your breath by then. Okay, so we don't need to decide, but just putting it on the table. With that, we have finished walking through the bill. So thanks, Senator Campion, for your questions that led to us getting to this point. It's been very helpful to me, and I hope to everyone, to see what our next draft of 234 will look like. We have floor at 11:30, but we've been going straight for 2.5 hours. How about if we take just a 10-minute break, come back at 11, and then look at that H233 language. So we could, while we're on the bill and have our thinking caps on, see what the alternative is related to how we might define fragmentation, or how we looked at doing it